Hey everybody, and welcome to part 2, Plan for Redesign Success. I am still Gary Welski. I am still the founder and nerd-in-chief of Copilot, and welcome back if you already checked out part 1 of this 2-part series. All right, we are going to be getting into some really great stuff with this presentation. Basically, we're going to be looking at one of the biggest questions folks have before starting a redesign project, which is how much is this going to cost me anyways? And also maybe why are all the bits I'm getting all over the place? We're going to talk about that too. And we're also going to talk about tips to find the right web developer for you and some of the questions you should certainly consider asking them to make sure that they're accounting for, both the success of the product and also your long-term success as well. So we're going to talk about a lot of great stuff, and I hope you find this super useful. Just in case you're finding this somewhere in the hinterland of the web like YouTube, just a little recap about who I am and what Copilot is about. I am Carrie Welski, and I am the founder of Copilot. Copilot is a web agency based out of Minneapolis, St. Paul that specializes in working with nonprofit organizations. And we do two things. We develop beautiful websites on WordPress and Squarespace, and we also provide ongoing care support via a monthly subscription called Copilot Care. So that is us in a nutshell, and certainly check out part number 1 if you have not already seen it. Okay, so figuring out your budget range for your project. One thing that is helpful in framing this conversation with potential web developers is to get a handle on what type of platform you probably are best suited to use. Now, when I say type of platform, basically what I'm encouraging you to do is, again, not get too tied into any particular platform per se, like WordPress, Squarespace, Drupal, etc., but to kind of understand the broad categories of platforms tend to fit in within these days, because it's kind of a way of getting a handle on the budget, of course, and also filtering out organizations that might not be a good fit for you, considering what type of platform you'd like to use. Let's talk about the different platforms within sort of broad brushstrokes. So at the moment, there are really two big buckets of different types of website platforms out there. And again, website platforms, I'm just talking about the software basically that you use to produce your website and manage your website. So website builders, these tend to be your Wix, your Weebly's, your Squarespaces. There are a lot of proprietary ones that are owned by different hosting companies out there as well. There's a ton of them out there. What distinguishes these types of platforms is that they are a lot quicker to develop on. They have limitations as to how much you can customize them, and they also have limitations as to how many sort of interesting plugins and capabilities and features can you build into them, because basically you are working with a for-profit company in this scenario that's kind of battened down the hatches and has created a product that's probably pretty specific, pretty limited, hopefully good, that will allow you to have a successful website, but might not do tons and tons of things above and beyond what a basic website would do, like a more information sharing, communications only sort of site. So that's sort of website builders. And these things are typified by drag and drop capabilities. So, you don't really need to know code necessarily to produce one of these sites. Although, of course, if you're going to do more sophisticated with, things with some of these sites like Squarespace, for instance, it certainly pays to have that sort of background. So easier to use, kind of what you see is what you get sort of software. All right. Next up, we've got content management systems, and this is sort of a misnomer, honestly. Like, technically, a website builder also allows you to manage content. However, this seems to be the term that the industry is using to talk about some of the more sophisticated platforms that are out there. So we're talking about your WordPresses, your Drupals, your Joomlas, There are some other products out there that are more proprietary than these open source tools that you may have heard of, that also sort of fit this bill. These are software platforms that have the ability to create a simple website sort of built into them, but are incredibly extensible and can be deeply customized and can also be integrated more successfully, even, with plugins or custom APIs, things like that. So if you are looking to do something more complex, more customized, something that can grow with you, maybe as your needs develop as an organization, then, having a content management system might be a better fit for you. And just, as an example, there are many news agencies, for instance, that use WordPress or Drupal as a platform. So that kind of gives you a sense of the scale, that these websites can do. And that's probably not you, but if you want to do something more sophisticated, these things might still be appropriate for you. Okay, cool. So those are our two big budget buckets. And so the question kind of comes down to, okay, which one's more appropriate for you? Then you're going to be asking yourself, okay, how complex is this website going to be in terms of the different things I need it to do? And also, how custom is it going to be based on my brand and my needs for, control over how it looks and, maybe specifications regarding how that brand needs to be interpreted. All right, so what I've done here is, list a couple of things to consider. So the first thing to ask yourself is, are we really looking for more of a brochureware site? So a brochureware site, if you haven't heard the term, is pretty self-explanatory. It's basically a website that's like a sophisticated brochure on the internet, that has mostly just sort of simple content, photos, videos, written things that convey, whatever you want to express to the public about your organization. So that is a brochureware site. And that type of thing is really perfect for a website builder, assuming, of course, that website builder still allows you to have the aesthetic look and, the functionality that you're looking for. All right, and I will say that even with a brochure website, you still can have different sort of aspects that connect to different software that you're using. So for instance, if you're using Salesforce and you're like, gosh, we would love to have a Salesforce form that connects the website donation page to our database so that information flows between them and we don't have to do all this double entry at the end of the month, when it comes to reconciling what information's where and all that good stuff. That type of thing is achievable without something, custom or super sophisticated. A lot of services out there allow you to embed things, using JavaScript that allow those sort of forms and utilities to connect and collect data and push that data back to different databases. So even if you want a brochure website, but you still want to have, donation forms that push data back to your donor database, for instance, that is achievable, even with a fairly simple tool like Squarespace, for instance. Where things get more complex and more custom, if you're looking for things like searchable databases, so staff directories or directories of resources and information, calendars that are sophisticated and maybe require registration and things like that, custom page templates where you have sophisticated information sharing needs. So for instance, one of my old clients, they were a foundation and a bank that provided funding for different types of development projects, so buildings, basically apartment buildings, things of that nature. And so we created a very custom blog template that allowed them to share very specific aspects about each development project that they had, and like little clickable links that related back to their mission, vision, values, that allowed people to explore all of their project content, through the lens of their mission, vision, values, and different aspects of it. So really, if you're looking to create something that's very specific, in terms of the templates and how they function, then that's when you start edging into that territory where what we're calling content management systems like WordPress and Drupal are more appropriate, because they allow you to have deeper control over the ability to customize things. And then things that have still more complexity, APIs. So what I'm talking about here are just basically, well, it stands for Application Programming Interface. You don't need to know that, but now you know. What these sort of things allow you to do is to actually have data pushed from sort of one system to another. Like in that earlier Salesforce example I was talking about, it's almost like you're producing a window into your database, essentially. And in this scenario, it's more like, like a bucket brigade or something. It's like information is coming to your website as an application, and then, being saved in a database, in the back end, and then being pushed to another database. So instead of a window into a system, what you're doing is creating a sophisticated flow of data from one application, which is your website, to another external database. And that can get costly and expensive. Sometimes it's absolutely appropriate and necessary, and you should do it. But we're talking about bigger bucks here when you're looking at doing that. Membership capabilities as well. That can be quite expensive as well. So, the ability to log into the website and check your membership dues and things of that effect. There are ways to link to like external membership websites to have those capabilities. But if you're looking to have like an integrated membership functionality on your website, then that is going to be more expensive. And so what I've done with this little arrow over here to the side is kind of represent, okay, things at the top, things that are more straightforward might be more appropriate for a website builder, and things that are more sophisticated, more custom, are going to be more appropriate for a content management system. And your cost kind of goes up exponentially as things get more custom and complex, is how generally it works. So let's talk about that cost. So we've got Squarespace and other sort of website builders on one side of the spectrum being less expensive. And then as you kind of get more sophisticated, like Webflow, for instance, is another website builder, but it's a little more kind of in the weeds. There are kind of more details that they allow you to access. So that takes a little more engineering, basically, to get it to work for you. And then you have, the more sophisticated content management systems, WordPress, Drupal. Again, these things can be used to produce simple websites, but, there may be disadvantages to using that much tool to do something very simple when a platform like Squarespace might do the same thing very well and have less sort of downsides, basically. One thing that I will point to is that even though I mentioned things like Wix and Weebly, etc. before, the tricky thing with some of the website builders is that some of them, to be perfectly honest, are quite poor in terms of the options and their performance. And so really the only tools that I put down here are ones that I have personally used to produce websites successfully before. So, that is just my personal opinion. I am certain there are other platforms out there that are totally adequate. My recommendation to you is, as you're looking at different tools and talking to web developers who are going to specialize in different tools, is to ask to tour them if you're not familiar. So, go to their portfolio, see examples, ask for a tour of the back end, so they can demonstrate, okay, how easy is this actually to update? If it's a platform that you're not familiar with, I think it pays to do a little tire kicking when it comes to that kind of stuff. I was really selective about the logos that I put on this slide because these are ones that I vetted and trust personally. And they are the only things I feel comfortable, putting here. So not the only names in the games, but certainly ones that I personally consider sufficient, for different types of projects. Okay, great. Okay, so budget estimates. At some point, you're going to have to start talking to folks to figure out, okay, how much does this kind of cost me? Um, Again, this is one of those frustrating things when you first start talking to any web developer, is that at some point in the conversation, they will ask you, what is your budget? And you'll probably say, we don't know yet. So this is kind of how you get around that process. Basically, what you're doing is having informal conversations with maybe 3 to 5 different web developers or web agencies, possibly with the creative brief as your guide. Perfect tool for this type of conversation. Use those conversations not to get a proposal from them, but just to get a very, very simple informal estimate and conversation with them about, okay, this is what the budget could be, or this is what I would budget, for a project like this potentially. And then also their thoughts about a recommended timeline. How long does a project of this complexity typically take, as well as potential pitfalls, knowing what they know, knowing what they've seen in your creative brief and from your conversation. Do they have concerns about how this is going to unfold? Folks who have been in the biz for a while and been in the trenches and, just live with those experiences, often have a sense of where things could be problematic. So it's nice to have an honest conversation with people about those challenges. And, I think it's healthy to ask yourself too, if someone's not able to really think or offer those things, if they're necessarily the best partner for you, because that kind of speaks to some inexperience or perhaps some inauthenticity, which might be a concern. So it's always good to, ask people for that question, encourage them to, speak truth to you about gritty, hard things, and just see what happens. Okay, great. So then as you're having these conversations, of course, note the estimates that you're getting from people, document those, put those somewhere where you can find them. And then at this point, it's a great opportunity to think about the conversations that you've already been having internally and really ask yourself, like, gosh, is this like a reality check moment? Like, do we need to reset, maybe restart, maybe reconsider, our expectations about what we want to get from this engagement to deal with the reality, the financial reality that our organization has right now. And I will say that another useful way of kind of reframing things, in case you end up in a situation where you're like, oh my gosh, we did not think it would cost this much money. It can be helpful to begin thinking about the website in terms of phases. So maybe the phase 1 focuses on the foundational aspects of a website. And then in a phase 2, you could look at that whiz bang something, membership capability or fancy integration or something, as something that could be approached the following year or something to that effect. That can be super useful and allow you to move forward in a productive way and also not, basically overdo it and end up with something that's half built. So something to consider there. Okay, cool. And then of course, note the vibe in these conversations. Would you like to work with this person? Like, do you feel like you trust them? Do they seem to be good communicators? Are they prompt? Do they clearly, set up meetings and meet their expectations that they put forth and all that good stuff? Because a huge aspect of a successful project isn't just, of course, do they actually have the technical chops to do the thing that you need them to do? It's also, do they have the capacity? Is my project a big enough priority? What is their communication style? And, do I like this person? Do I feel like I could actually work intensively with them on a project? It's nice to consider those questions as well, those sort of intangibles. So you can kind of note who you would be potentially asking to write a proposal at a future date. Okay, great. So at this point, you're like, these interviews sound wonderful, but where the heck do I find people? So there are some great resources to answer this question. One is your IT support company. If you have a managed IT company already, and hopefully you have enough resources that you do, they likely have a short list of people that they know who are web developers who they consider responsible, who have probably worked with many others of their clients before. So, going to them, I think, is a great first step to get some recommendations that have already kind of been filtered, by them. That is always a super smart thing to do. Another great resource is the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits have a nonprofit Tech Talk listserv, which is basically like a email group, so it has, I think, around 800 folks on it currently, and most of them are nonprofit folks who are in Minnesota, although some are from all over. And it's just a resource for people who have questions. So you can go there, ask folks who they've worked with, who they'd recommend, and also use it as a resource for any kind of technology or digital communications questions that you have. It's a great group to be on, and MCN very generously doesn't restrict that to people who are members. They really keep that alive as a public resource, which I think is a beautiful thing. So you can Google that. I'll also link to that on my gopilot.org/webinar page so that you can access that community there as well. So wonderful place to go to. Next up is the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits Business Directory, which I believe is called the Special List. It is a good resource for finding some of these folks. And MCN isn't necessarily endorsing any of these folks, but these are at least people who are invested enough in the community that they're willing to put themselves in this directory. So you can at least assume that they've probably worked with other nonprofit organizations before. So certainly worth checking out. Another great resource is just websites you like. So are there colleague organizations, folks who are doing similar work who have beautiful websites? Asking them who those people are, who they partnered with, is a great next step. If they're not in your sector and they have a great site, ask those people too. You can find some good recommendations by just reaching out to people. People often can be surprisingly generous in answering these types of questions, so worth giving it a try. So you sat down with different folks, you've had these interviews, you've gotten a bunch of informal estimates from people. One question that you might be asking yourself at this point is, gosh, why are they all so different? The bids that we got were just wildly all over the board, and I don't know if people are yanking my chain here or what's going on. So this is a great opportunity for us to talk about the other sort of factor in determining what your budget will be. So again, this was by formula from a previous slide. So a budget kind of equals your complexity of your scope, what you need, the amount of like customization, to the design and things like that, and then this mysterious X factor. Well, the mysterious X factor is basically who you work with. Your budget is not based only on what you need, it's also based on that agency, that individual. And the truth is, that agencies of different sizes have different challenges. Many of them that are bigger, have wonderful folks who work with them and do great work, but they also have greater operating expenses as well, because in addition to their web developers and their program managers and things like that, they also, have admin staff and have salespeople. So, that cost is passed along to you. So that is part of this X factor. And of course, part of the X factor also is likely the amount of experience, of course, of the agency or the individual that you're talking to. And this kind of basically says the same thing here that I just said. It is based on experience to some extent, and like hiring a staff member, the person who's willing to work for the least isn't necessarily the right person for the job. All right, so that being said, how do you find the right web developer, and what questions would it make sense to ask them as you're exploring different options? So basically, the right web developer for your project, it's kind of a Goldilocks scenario, in my opinion, in my experience. What you're going to want to look for is a good pitch of, the technical capabilities, the size of the team that you're working with, and the type of platform that they recommend, and your budget. So it's sort of this Venn diagram of all those aspects. So here listed on the left, what I have is sort of a spread of different varieties of folks who you might work with to produce your website. So at the beginning, you've got e-lancers. So these are going to be folks who you might connect with online through some of these e-lancing websites or through an e-lancing company. And these are folks who, may be able to produce something for you. That's fantastic. It's probably really only going to be successful if you are very limited in terms of what you need, and if you are very, very organized. You already know how to write content for the web. You understand SEO, because these e-lancers oftentimes, they are able to do what they do because they do a lot of websites quickly. So if you're looking for a partner who's going to really pull out of you some deep insights or train you on things like, how to write for accessibility or for search engine optimization, for the best, content on the web, they're probably not going to be the right person, to work with you. So something to consider. I would also, you'll notice to the right here, I've got, again, another one of these arrow spectrums that goes from website builder to CMS. These are the types of platforms that I would trust, these different types of folks to work with, basically. So as a great example, let's talk about volunteers next. So you might have a really, really wonderful volunteer who is a professional web developer who has the ability to create a very sophisticated CMS, website for you with WordPress or Drupal or one of those types of solutions. That is wonderful. But the tricky thing is, because they're a volunteer, they're not going to be around forever. If you are choosing a solution that's a more sophisticated content management system, really you want to have somebody who can help you with things like upgrades of the software, backups of the website, ongoing support questions, because whatever this tool is that they're creating for you is more sophisticated just by the nature of the platform that it's on, the software that it's running. So that is why, if you have a volunteer, fantastic, that's great. Ask them about next steps. Ask them about, okay, what happens in 3 years when the website goes down? And can I call you in the middle of the night? These are just important things to be thinking about. So if you're going to go that route of like a more sophisticated website with a volunteer, you're going to want like a backup plan, some kind of agency, I would recommend, who you are paying to help you with some of those long-term support issues. So something to keep in the back of your mind. Otherwise, what I might do is just ask my volunteer, gosh, hey, I love that you have all this experience. Would you consider helping us with a website builder? Because that's probably going to meet our needs and also be sustainable for us technologically. Because with a website builder, you're talking about software that is already maintained and upgraded by the company that produces it. And it's more straightforward. There's less stuff that's going to break potentially for you. So these are important questions to ask and things to consider as you think about some of those more affordable, partnership opportunities. Next up, you've got solo developers. And with these, it's that same sort of question. I think it comes down to, okay, yes, maybe they can create that sophisticated CMS, but do they have that answer for a long-term support relationship? And then you have boutique agencies like Copilot. And these are folks, generally speaking, of course, you should always ask the right questions, and we'll get to those right questions in a little bit. But generally speaking, these are people who are more established, and when they're a boutique, you know, hopefully they're they basically have just enough of that sort of sophistication and expertise on staff. Because they're smaller, they don't have maybe the same volume of overhead that a bigger agency might have. So there's always trade-offs, you know, with different size agencies. I find that the boutique agency, for most medium-sized organizations at least, could be a good fit because they're kind of right-sized for the needs that folks typically have, as well as folks who are prepared to talk about these long-term accountability questions and have real substantive answers to them. Finally, of course, we've got large agencies, and large agencies can be amazing to work with because they've got a deep bench of very professional people to draw on. I will say that some of the challenges here, of course, cost is one of them. Another challenge can be, depending on the size of your project, is that you kind of get a small fish in a big pond kind of effect. You could find yourself in a situation where your project, if it is smaller, might be shunted aside, unfortunately, because the organization that you're working with might have bigger priorities, bigger accounts that they're concerned about. And hopefully in a perfect world, that would never be the case, but I've seen it happen. And so I just want you to, straight up ask someone if they're a bigger organization, particularly if they're a bigger organization that's giving you some kind of discount, are we going to end up in a situation where we're deprioritized? And if that's the case, like, I want to know what that looks like up front, and do we have any recourse and all that good stuff. Another thing to consider with this too is that you might be working with junior staff people, and they might do a fantastic job. However, maybe they're great at the code, but they're not as great at maybe communication or project management or something to that effect. So it's good to just be mindful of these potential pitfalls. Again, there's benefits to working with all of these types of people. There are also real drawbacks. So something to consider as you're considering, okay, where is our Goldilocks inflection point on the spectrum of expense and complexity and experience? All right, so now that you're a little more informed about different types of platforms and different types of agencies, it's your opportunity now to revisit the list of places where you originally found leads to have your conversation about budget expectations. So go back to that list, find more potential targets now that you have a clearer understanding of what's out there and what your budget is. Okay, great. Cool. And then just where are those people again? Same places we talked about earlier. Just revisit these, generate some new leads, and just see what comes of it. Okay, cool. So another aspect of this conversation of recruiting the right web developer is often this RFP or no RFP question. So for those of you who might not be familiar with this process, basically an RFP is a request for a proposal, which a nonprofit or a for-profit business might produce. And it's a multi-page document that describes the scope of the project and other details like, the budget range, the timeline, and all that good stuff. Traditionally, back in ye olden days, what you would do is you would post this RFP somewhere and you would receive a whole flood of folks responding to the RFP, you hope. Sometimes the flood will be a trickle and then you kind of have to start over again. But even in the scenario where you receive a lot of responses, oftentimes the challenge would be then wading through all of those responses to find out who's actually relevant, who's kind of a con artist. So for that reason, what I recommend, instead of doing kind of the traditional open RFP process, unless you're required to by law, sometimes you are, based on where you're getting your funding, that kind of good stuff, or your, board criteria, policies, etc. My sort of recommendation as an alternative is to do one of two things. One, you can do a closed RFP and interview. So what you could do is expand your list approach maybe 3 to 5 organizations that you feel have a solid reputation. Maybe you've had sort of pre-qualifying conversations with them before and you sort of vetted them a little. Approach those folks with your RFP. Say it's a closed RFP. They're going to be flattered and also more invested if you kind of actually seek them out actively, and then go from there and kind of proceed with that process. Another thing you can do that I find is often just enough to, find the right people is to do interviews with your creative brief as your document, as your conversation starting point with that agency. So take that creative brief, walk them through that creative brief, see what questions they have and ideas that inspires for them, and then also ask some of the due diligence questions that I'm about to share with you. That can frequently be just enough sort of structure and intentionality and documentation around a process to get some real valid results from people, accurate bids that will lead to successful website projects. Okay, cool. So let's talk about questions to ask. This list of questions is by no means exhaustive, and I think one of the things I'm going to do next is actually create a more comprehensive list of questions. That being said, these are some of the ones that I think are absolutely crucial to ask as you're interviewing prospects, and your expectations will vary based on, again, that complexity scale that we looked at, the e-lancers all the way to the, big agencies. They're going to answer these questions in different ways. So something to consider as well. So first question, what happens if the project goes over? So making sure that they have a clear policy for what happens in case the worst happens. That is absolutely essential. What does their development process look like? There are going to be commonalities, and at the same time, it's useful to see what differentiates different teams from one another. So if they can share a document that kind of outlines that process or walk you through it, I think that's a healthy thing to kind of walk through, see if it kind of fits your culture. And who will you be working with? So just figuring out, okay, what's the internal web agency team going to look like? Are we working with a team of senior level people? Are we working with a single junior level person? How are those roles divided? That could be very useful to ask. Okay, what's their average project budget? This can be helpful if they're willing to share, because it kind of gives you an idea of, are you a big fish? Are you a little fish to them? Which can, give you some sort of behind the scenes insight on what your experience may be like. So good question to ask. Next up, how is search engine optimization a part of each project? Hopefully they will have an answer to this. Really anyone, who's really anyone should have an answer to this no matter what. But you can expect more depth and complexity likely from people who are kind of at that solo entrepreneur, through boutique to, full big agency. Folks who are, merely volunteers or e-lancers, they'll probably have some knowledge, but it may not be their area of expertise, quite honestly, because there's a lot that goes into a successful website. So although it's good to ask, maybe adjust your expectations accordingly. Okay, great. And how do they account for ADA compliance with their website? So this, and I'm happy to see it, is becoming something that more folks are proactively asking Copilot about, as they engage us for new projects, which I love to see. So what we're talking about with ADA compliance is basically disability access. Do they set up their websites in such a way that it's accessible to people who have gross motor, auditory, or visual impairments? Hopefully, what you're going to hear from them is yes, we do. And it's a variety of tactics that start with the structure of the site itself and go through each phase of the web development process. Including, training your folks on how to add content to the website in such a way that it better communicates to people using assistive devices. Hopefully that's what you're going to hear. But at the very least, it's good to talk about this because it is an important aspect of equity, which we as nonprofits are concerned with. So good to ask. Also handy if someone ever says like, oh gosh, we'll just put one of those little overlay buttons, that lets people increase text or something. And if that's the only thing they say, be concerned about that, because that is not enough and sometimes can actually have the opposite effect. But that's a different webinar. Email me if you want to hear that webinar. Okay, cool. So what do they do to make their platform more secure? This is a great question. Because whether you're working with a website builder or a content management system like WordPress that's more sophisticated, you just want to know, are they thinking about security in the long term? Can they help you and your team set up things like multi-factor authentication so that you can be more proactive about protecting the investment that you made in this website? And then finally, do they provide ongoing support and hosting? This is going to be more relevant, again, for those content management system providers. But it's still good to know, even if you're working with someone who just only works on Squarespace, can I call you or email you in the future if I have a question or if we need to train someone? It's important to know, I think, whether that this is an ongoing relationship, and hopefully it is, or if you're going to have to find someone else for that ongoing support, because you're going to need it in some way. And you're certainly going to need it if you're using an open source content management system like WordPress or Drupal, because those are things that need to be maintained in a more proactive way over time. So absolutely ask them to account for that. Great, so that's really the end of this two-part series, all of the good substance that we have. Hopefully you found this useful and entertaining, and it's going to help you have a successful website redesign here in the near future. There are some free things that I have to share with you. On the website, you can join the Fetch email list for future freebies. And when you do that, you can also download a copy of the Creative Brief template that I referred to in the previous part 1 of this presentation, and also a sample staff survey. So this is just a sample of a short form that you can send out to your team, adapt for your own needs, of course, to get a handle on what are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities with your current website and your future website, what we could be doing to make this more useful to the team. Great way to get their information, great way to also get them excited and engaged about this project. So absolutely check that out. And then, yep, this is where you can go to do that. And then questions, certainly, gosh, I'd love to hear from you all. So if you have questions, if you have different webinar topic ideas that you'd like to see in the future from Copilot, let us know. We would love to hear from you. Likewise, if you'd be interested in talking to us about your project or learning more about the Copilot ongoing support package that we are offering to folks now, absolutely be in touch. We'd love to hear from you. Well, thanks so much for attending this two-part series, and I hope with any luck it's going to help you be successful the first time with your next web development project. Thanks so much. Bye.